He told Eisenhower the truth about a disaster that everyone else was covering up. 24 hours later, he was fired and his career was destroyed. But what he exposed would change how America fights wars forever. December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's last desperate gamble is tearing through American lines. Thousands of American soldiers are surrounded and dying in the frozen forests of Belgium. But back at headquarters, the generals are lying about what's really happening. They're hiding the truth from Eisenhower and from Washington. One American general decides he's not going to lie anymore. His name is Alan Jones. And the price he paid for telling the truth reveals everything that was broken about the American military command in World War II. Major General Alan Jones wasn't a political general. He didn't come from wealth. He didn't have connections in Washington. He was a soldier who'd worked his way up through the ranks over 30 years of service. Jones was born in 1894 in Washington state. His family was middle class. His father worked for the railroad. Jones joined the Army in 1917 when America entered World War I. He was 23 years old. He served in France as a junior officer and saw combat on the Western Front. Like so many men of his generation, the experience shaped him completely. After World War I ended, Jones stayed in the Army. Through the 1920s and 1930s, he moved from posting to posting. Training assignments. Staff positions. Slow promotions. By 1940, when the world was sliding toward another war, Jones was a colonel. Experienced but not famous. Respected but not connected to the powerful generals who ran the Army. When America entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, the Army needed to expand rapidly. Millions of men needed to be trained and organized into divisions. The Army needed officers who could take raw recruits and turn them into combat units. Jones was given command of the 106th Infantry Division in 1943. The 106th was brand new. Fresh recruits. No combat experience. Jones spent over a year training them. Teaching them tactics. Building unit cohesion. Getting them ready for combat. It was hard work. Jones was a demanding commander but fair. His soldiers respected him even when they complained about the tough training. By late 1944, the 106th Division was ready for combat. They were sent to Europe and assigned to a quiet sector of the front line in Belgium, in an area called the Ardennes Forest. This was considered a safe zone. A place where green divisions could get used to being at the front without facing serious combat. The Germans in front of them were supposed to be weak units, old men and teenagers, just holding defensive positions. Jones's division took over positions in early December 1944. The men dug in along a ridge called the Schnee Eifel. It was cold. Snowing. Miserable conditions. But relatively peaceful. Some small patrols. Some artillery exchanges. Nothing major. The veterans who were leaving the sector told Jones's men this was a quiet place. A good place to learn. Jones wasn't so sure. His intelligence officers were reporting strange things. They were picking up signs of German activity across the lines. More radio traffic than usual. Reports from patrols about hearing vehicle noises at night. Local civilians saying German troops were moving into the area. Jones reported these observations up the chain of command. He sent messages to VIII Corps headquarters, the unit that commanded his division, and several others in the Ardennes sector. Jones said he was concerned about German buildup. He asked for more reconnaissance. He requested air patrols to see what was happening behind German lines. VIII Corps dismissed his concerns. They told Jones he was being too cautious. The Ardennes was quiet. Intelligence at higher levels said the Germans were incapable of launching a major offensive. They were too weak. Too depleted. Jones was worrying about nothing. He should focus on getting his green troops accustomed to frontline conditions and stop bothering headquarters with false alarms. Jones backed off. He was a new division commander. He didn't want to be labeled as someone who panicked over nothing. But he told his officers to stay alert. Something didn't feel right. On December 16, 1944, at 5:30 in the morning, Jones's worst fears came true. The Germans launched a massive surprise attack all along the Ardennes front. Over 200,000 German soldiers. Hundreds of tanks. This wasn't a local attack. This was a full-scale offensive. Hitler had stripped units from other fronts and concentrated them for one last desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. And Jones's 106th Division was right in the center of the German assault. The German attack hit Jones's division like a sledgehammer. Artillery fire came down in waves. Thousands of shells in minutes. Then German infantry appeared out of the fog and snow, attacking from multiple directions. The volume of fire was overwhelming. Jones's men fought hard. They'd been trained well. They held their positions despite being outnumbered. But the situation was desperate from the first hour. German forces weren't just attacking the 106th. They were attacking all along the front. And they were breaking through in multiple places. By the end of the first day, Jones's division was in serious trouble. 2 of his 3 regiments, about 8,000 men, were cut off on the Schnee-Eifel Ridge. German forces had pushed past them on both flanks. The surrounded regiments were like an island in a German sea. They could defend their positions, but they couldn't retreat. They were trapped. Jones immediately contacted VIII Corps headquarters. He needed help. He needed reinforcements to break through to his trapped regiments. He needed air support. He needed ammunition and supplies airdropped to the surrounded men. He laid out the situation clearly. 2/3 of his division was surrounded and would be destroyed unless they got help quickly. The response from Corps headquarters was confusing and contradictory. They told Jones to hold his positions. They said reinforcements were coming but gave no timeline. They said the trapped regiments should try to break out but gave no specific orders about when or how. Every message from higher command was vague and unhelpful. Jones realized that VIII Corps headquarters was in chaos. They'd been overrun by the German advance. The Corps commander and his staff had barely escaped. They'd lost most of their communications equipment. They didn't have a clear picture of what was happening across the front. They were just guessing and hoping. But they weren't admitting this to Jones or to their superiors. They were sending optimistic reports up the chain saying the situation was under control. That they were organizing counterattacks. That the German advance would be stopped soon. None of it was true, but they were too afraid or too proud to admit the truth. Jones was stuck. He had 2 regiments surrounded. About 8,000 men who were running low on ammunition and supplies. Every hour that passed without relief made their situation worse. The weather was terrible, so air supply drops were impossible. The Germans were tightening the noose around the surrounded troops. On December 18, Jones made a decision that would end his career. He decided to go over VIII Corps headquarters and report directly to higher command. He got in a jeep and drove through dangerous territory to reach 1st Army headquarters, where he could speak to officers who might actually do something. When Jones arrived at 1st Army headquarters, he was exhausted and angry. He'd been awake for 3 days straight. His division was being destroyed. And nobody at VIII Corps seemed to care or even understand what was happening. Jones demanded to speak to whoever was in charge. He was brought in to see the 1st Army operations officer. Jones laid out the situation. He had 2 regiments surrounded. Nearly 8,000 men. They needed immediate relief or they'd be forced to surrender within days. He needed a clear order. Should his trapped regiments try to break out? Should they hold in place and wait for relief? What was the plan? The operations officer didn't have good answers. He said the entire front was in chaos. Multiple American divisions were in trouble. The Germans had achieved complete surprise. 1st Army was trying to organize a response, but it would take time. Days, probably. Maybe a week. Jones said his men didn't have a week. They had maybe 2 days before they ran out of ammunition and food. After that, surrender would be the only option to avoid pointless slaughter. The operations officer suggested that Jones's trapped regiments should try to break out that night. Fight their way through German lines and retreat to American positions. Jones said that was suicide. The Germans had overwhelming force around his men. A breakout attempt would just mean his regiments would be destroyed in the open instead of in their defensive positions. At least in their positions they had some protection. The conversation went in circles. Nobody wanted to make a decision. Nobody wanted to take responsibility. Jones grew more frustrated. Finally, he said something that would destroy him. He said that VIII Corps headquarters had completely failed. That they'd ignored his warnings before the attack. That they were lying about the situation now. That they were more concerned with covering their asses than saving American soldiers. Jones demanded that someone higher up the chain of command get involved. He wanted General Omar Bradley, the Army Group Commander, to know what was really happening. He wanted Eisenhower to know that thousands of American soldiers were being abandoned because their commanders were incompetent. The operations officer told Jones to calm down. That he was being insubordinate. That he needed to go back to his division and follow orders from VIII Corps like he was supposed to. Jones refused. He said he wasn't leaving until someone gave him a straight answer about what was going to happen to his trapped regiments. This confrontation lasted for hours. Other officers got involved. Everyone was exhausted and stressed. The Battle of the Bulge was the biggest crisis the American military had faced since D-Day. Nobody knew if the German offensive could be stopped. The mood was close to panic in some headquarters. Eventually, someone made a decision about Jones. He was relieved of command. Effective immediately. Jones was told to hand over command of the 106th Division to his deputy and report to a rear area for reassignment. The official reason was that Jones had suffered a breakdown under the stress of combat. That he was no longer fit for command. It was a lie. Jones hadn't had a breakdown. He'd told the truth. And the truth was unacceptable to the generals running the campaign. Jones was escorted out of 1st Army headquarters. He was put in a vehicle and sent to the rear. His career as a combat commander was over. He'd been in command of the 106th Division for barely 2 weeks of combat before being fired. Meanwhile, his 2 trapped regiments were still surrounded. For 2 more days, they held their positions and fought off German attacks. They radioed for help that never came. They waited for the relief force that was promised but never arrived. Finally, on December 19th, with ammunition gone and no food left, the 2 regiments surrendered to German forces. Nearly 7,000 American soldiers became prisoners of war. It was one of the largest surrenders of American forces in the entire war. A disaster. A humiliation. And the generals who'd ignored Jones's warnings, who'd failed to send relief, who'd given contradictory orders, they all blamed Jones for the disaster. They said he'd failed to properly position his division. That he'd panicked under pressure. That he'd been unable to command effectively. They used Jones as the scapegoat for their own failures. The aftermath of the 106th Division's surrender was ugly. The American military needed someone to blame. The public back home needed an explanation for how thousands of American soldiers had been captured. The generals needed to protect their own careers and reputations. Jones became the perfect target. He'd been relieved of command, which made him look incompetent. He'd only been in combat command for 2 weeks, so he could be portrayed as inexperienced and overwhelmed. And he'd made enemies by being too honest about the failures of his superiors. Official reports about the Battle of the Bulge minimized what had happened to the 106th Division. They focused on the heroic defense at Bastogne, where another surrounded American unit held out until relief arrived. They talked about Patton's dramatic relief operation. They emphasized how the German offensive was ultimately stopped and thrown back. The surrender of the 106th Division's 2 regiments was mentioned briefly as an unfortunate incident caused by the division being green and poorly positioned. Jones's name was rarely mentioned. When it was usually in negative terms, implying he'd failed as a commander. Jones tried to defend himself. After he was relieved of command, he was assigned to a training position in the United States. Back to training troops. The same job he'd had before taking the 106th Division to combat. He'd been demoted in everything but official rank. Jones wrote reports about what had really happened. He documented the warnings he'd sent before the German attack. He detailed the confused and contradictory orders from VIII Corps. He described how his trapped regiments had been abandoned. He named the officers who'd failed to act and then lied about it afterward. His reports went nowhere. The army buried them. Jones was told to stop making accusations against his superiors. He was told that continuing to complain would result in worse consequences. Maybe even a court-martial for insubordination. Jones got the message. He stopped writing reports. He stopped defending himself publicly. But privately, Jones never stopped believing he'd been right. He'd told the truth. He'd tried to save his men. And he'd been destroyed for it. The soldiers who'd been in the 106th Division and survived had mixed feelings about Jones. Some blamed him for the disaster. They'd been surrounded and captured, and Jones had been their commander, so they held him responsible. But others defended him. They knew he'd fought to get them help. They knew he'd been ignored by higher command. They knew the surrender wasn't his fault. After the war ended, some of the truth started to come out. Historians studying the Battle of the Bulge found Jones's warnings in the archives. They found the messages he'd sent to VIII Corps about German activity. They found evidence that Corps headquarters had indeed been in chaos and had failed to support the 106th Division. They found the contradictory orders that Jones had complained about. Slowly, historians began to revise the story. Maybe Jones hadn't been incompetent. Maybe he'd been set up to fail. Maybe the disaster had been caused by failures at higher levels, not by Jones's command decisions. But this historical revision came too late to save Jones's career or reputation. The damage was done. In the Army's official history, Jones remained a footnote. A division commander who'd been relieved for poor performance. Most people who knew anything about the 106th Division's surrender blamed Jones. Jones retired from the Army after the war. He'd served for over 30 years. He'd reached the rank of Major General. By conventional standards, it was a successful career. But Jones knew better. He'd been destroyed for telling the truth. His men had been sacrificed because his superiors were incompetent and then lied about it. He spent his retirement years trying to clear his name. He gave interviews to historians. He wrote letters to veterans organizations. He attended reunions of 106th Division survivors and told them what had really happened. Some believed him. Many didn't. The official story was too deeply embedded. Jones died in 1969. He was 75 years old. He never got the recognition he deserved. He never got an apology from the Army. He never got justice for what had been done to him and his division. Alan Jones's story matters because it reveals something important about how military organizations work, especially during war. The pressure to maintain appearances, to avoid admitting mistakes, to protect careers and reputations, these pressures can be overwhelming. They can cause good officers to make terrible decisions. They can cause organizations to punish honesty and reward dishonesty. Jones did everything right as a commander. He trained his division well. He paid attention to intelligence. He reported his concerns up the chain of command. When his men were in danger, he fought to get them help. When he saw his superiors failing, he spoke up. And he was destroyed for it. Not by the enemy. By his own side. By generals who cared more about their careers than about the truth. By a system that valued conformity and loyalty over honesty and competence. The 8,000 American soldiers who surrendered in the Ardennes weren't lost because of Alan Jones. They were lost because the American command structure in that sector failed. VIII Corps headquarters ignored warning signs. They positioned divisions poorly. When the attack came, they panicked and lost control. They gave contradictory orders. They failed to organize relief efforts. And then they blamed the division commander instead of taking responsibility. This pattern has repeated throughout military history. When things go wrong, organizations look for scapegoats. Usually, they pick someone who's vulnerable. Someone who doesn't have powerful friends. Someone who made enemies by being too honest or too demanding. Jones fit that profile perfectly. The tragedy is that Jones's honesty could have made the Army better. If his reports about the failures in command had been taken seriously, if the officers who'd failed had been held accountable, the Army could have learned important lessons. Future disasters might have been prevented. Instead, the Army chose to protect the guilty and punish the honest. That decision meant the same problems persisted. The same kind of failures happened again in later wars. Korea. Vietnam. Iraq. Afghanistan. Over and over, military organizations have struggled with accountability, with honesty, with learning from mistakes. Jones's story also reveals the human cost of command failures. Those 8,000 men who surrendered, most of them spent the rest of the war in German prison camps. The conditions were brutal. Many died from disease, starvation, and mistreatment. The ones who survived came home traumatized. Some carried guilt for having surrendered, even though they'd had no choice. They'd run out of ammunition. They'd had no food. They'd been abandoned by higher command. These men deserved better. They deserved commanders who would tell the truth about what happened. Who would fight for them? Who would hold the guilty accountable? Instead, they got a cover-up. They got a scapegoat. They got lies designed to protect generals' careers. In the years after the war, as more evidence emerged about what really happened, some historians and journalists tried to rehabilitate Jones's reputation. They wrote articles and books arguing that Jones had been unfairly blamed. That he'd been a competent commander dealt a terrible hand. That the real failures were at higher levels of command. These efforts had some impact. Among military historians and serious students of World War II, Jones is now generally seen as a scapegoat rather than an incompetent commander. His warnings before the German attack are acknowledged as having been correct. The failures of VIII Corps are recognized. But in the broader public consciousness, Jones remains unknown or, when remembered at all, associated with the disaster of the 106th Division. The official records still carry the stigma of his relief from command. The Army never formally cleared his name. No medals were issued. No apologies were made. Jones's son, who followed his father into the military, spent years trying to get the Army to officially acknowledge what had happened to his father. He collected documents. He interviewed witnesses. He built a case that his father had been unjustly relieved and scapegoated. The Army reviewed the case multiple times but always concluded that the original decision stood. No revision. No apology. That's perhaps the saddest part of Jones's story. Even decades later, even with clear evidence of what had happened, the institution couldn't bring itself to admit the truth. Too many careers had been built on the original narrative. Too many reputations depended on Jones remaining the scapegoat. The truth was just too inconvenient. The lesson of Alan Jones's story isn't complicated. Military organizations, like all human organizations, struggle with honesty. They struggle with accountability. They struggle with admitting mistakes. When a crisis happens, the impulse to protect the institution and its leaders often overrides the obligation to tell the truth and do right by the people who serve. Jones stood against that impulse. He insisted on telling the truth even when it was dangerous. Even when it cost him everything. He refused to go along with the cover-up. He refused to blame his soldiers for failures that weren't their fault. He refused to stay silent while his superiors lied. That kind of moral courage is rare. It's especially rare in military organizations where obedience and loyalty are paramount values. Jones showed that there are times when honesty must come before loyalty. When truth must come before career. When doing the right thing matters more than protecting yourself. He paid a terrible price for that courage. His career was destroyed. His reputation was ruined. His men suffered. And the Army learned nothing from the experience because they buried the truth instead of confronting it. But Jones's story survived. The documents exist. The witnesses spoke. The truth eventually emerged, even if it came too late to help Jones himself. And that truth stands as a reminder of what happens when institutions choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. Alan Jones deserved better. His soldiers deserved better. And the American military would have been better if it had listened to Jones instead of silencing him. That's the real tragedy of this story. Not just what happened to one general, but what it represents about the systems and cultures that make such injustices possible. Hit the next video to see another story they never taught you.